After that example, which introduced us to various important concepts and theories of trade law, now we are actually going to look at some of those things. So international trade is not something that is started relatively recently. It's something that goes back centuries. As you can see in this slide, I have named the most popular international trade theories, starting with mercantilism and neo-mercantilism, which happened between roughly around 1500 to 1800. And then the theory of absolute advantage, advanced by Adam Smith in 1776. The theory of comparative advantage, introduced by David Ricardo and other economists in 1819. Then the theory of factor proportions. Then the theory of product cycle theory, and the diamond national advantage. So we will look into each one of those now. Mercantilism. So what is mercantilism? This is a theory that is, in fact, that was practiced by the colonial rulers during the colonialization period. The definition of mercantilism that is the most popular, there are various definitions for mercantilism, but the most popular one is, which I have produced in this slide, where mercantilism is a theory that states a nation can increase its wealth in two ways. One, by obtaining as much gold and silver as possible. Now you will remember in your example earlier, where Vestia insisted on gold from Tropica. So likewise, mercantilism is a theory that says you can increase your wealth if you have more gold and silver as much as possible, and by establishing a favorable balance of trade. So we discussed earlier about trade imbalances. So you already understand when we say a favorable trade balance would be a trade balance where you get to export more and import less. So in which it sold more goods than it bought. So two things. One, you have to have a lot of gold and silver, and the other, you have to export more and import less. You have to sell more and buy less. The key to mercantilism was the establishment of colonies, because colonies presented the colonial rulers as a captive market. For example, just to take an example, Sri Lanka, India, that belonged to the British Empire, we were ready markets for the British to sell their finished products. And in turn, our natural resources were exported to our colonial ruler, maybe British, in return for the goods, finished products that they supplied. So here we examine how the mercantilism theory was put in place by creating a favorable trade balance, export more than import, create colonies to use as markets to sell your goods, and restrict colonies from trading with other nations. That was very important for the colonial rulers, because if they had their colonies being able to purchase things from other sellers other than the colonial ruler themselves, then they will not get that favorable trade balance. So this was an important thing that the colonial rulers put in place. Here is a cartoon version I found on the internet, which depicts this thing. You can see the three ladies, just like the maidens. They are bringing gold and silver, foodstuff, raw materials. Those were the things that the colonial rulers needed to make products in their factories. So you can see the mother country sitting at the table, and these three things are being served at her, which the colonial ruler will in turn use to in their manufacturing plants to make products. And in turn, where do they sell that? They sell that to the colonies, which were their captive market. So mercantilism here is another example of how mercantilism was put in motion. So you can see the Europe on the right-hand side of your screen. They are sending textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to Africa, which was one of their colonies. And from Africa, what do they get? They get slaves to the Americas. America was also a colony of the Europeans at one time. And from America, they put the slaves to work in their sugar and tobacco plants. And after the slaves worked, they get the harvest of sugar, tobacco, and cotton back to Europe. So it was a sort of what you call a vicious cycle. The colonial empire, the colonial ruler had a captive market, had a captive labor force, and they, through the captive labor, they made the finished products and sold it to the colonized, sold it to their colonies themselves. So then the theory of neo-mercantilism. So after this mercantilism was put into place, and little by little when countries, the colonies started feeling that they are not getting any benefit out of this arrangement. Like you saw in that example, how Tropica started feeling that they did not get anything positive as much as Westia did. The idea of neo-colonialism came about. That is where when countries started feeling like Tropica started feeling the disadvantage a little bit more, they started asking for a little bit more independence, less trade barriers to deal with this by themselves. So neo-mercantilism is a policy regime that encourages exports. So even the colonies can now export, discouraged imports. So it introduced a little bit of trade barriers that would discourage imports, controls capital movement, like we saw in the example where central banks started imposing foreign currency regulations and centralized currency decisions in the hands of the central government. So here you have already now been introduced to the trade barriers that countries put in place to safeguard their industries and their currency devaluations and having to sell their gold and in place of currency. So we've already been introduced examples. So this is the concept. And some of the drawbacks of mercantilism theory or neo-mercantilism theory. Mercantilism weakens the country. As we saw, it weakened Tropica. Restrictions on free trade decreases a country's wealth. So you remember towards the end, the Tropicians felt that the protectionism attitude that they had, in fact, was detrimental to them in that it reduced their ability to be manufacturing states. Now, 3 overlooks other factors such as natural resources, manpower, and its skill level, capital extractor. Restrictive policies promoting exports and restricts imports, creating trade barriers. Colonial exploitation. So here now, the world in 1500 to 1800s at the early stages experimented with mercantilism, then neo-mercantilism. Then they realized that there are these barriers and that it doesn't work for everybody unless you're in equal status. So little by little, the world started coming up with different theories or different mechanisms for trade. And one of those 2 very popular theories of trade is this theory of absolute advantage and the theory of comparative advantage. Now, the theory of comparative advantage is a response that highlighted the drawbacks of the theory of absolute advantage. Both of these are not practiced in its original state to date, but these are important theories that we need to know in the evolution of how international trade came into being. The theory of absolute advantage was introduced by Adam Smith, who was a world-renowned economist. He lived between 1723 to 1790. He was a Scottish moral philosopher and an economist. He's known as the father of modern economics, and he has written the world-famous book, The Wealth of Nations. And this theory of the absolute advantage was first introduced to us in the book that he wrote, The Wealth of Nations. So what is absolute advantage? So absolute advantage can be broken, the theory can be broken down into these 4 elements that export those goods and services for which a country is more productive than other countries, meaning have a production advantage. You export to other countries goods and services that you're good at doing, that you don't need to depend on anybody else. Import those goods and services for which other countries are more productive than it is. So if another country is more good at producing garments, import the garments from them and export. If you are better at producing wine, like Tropica, export wine to the country that you're getting garments from. A country should concentrate on production of goods in which it holds an absolute advantage. So he's advancing the theory. You only concentrate on production of goods for which you have an absolute advantage. For example, Sri Lanka is good at producing rubber. So if we are to implement this absolute advantage theory of Adam Smith, he would be telling us, Sri Lanka is very good at the production of rubber. So you focus only on the production of rubber, nothing else. And that would be your absolute advantage. Then that theory also measures nations' wealth by the standard of living of its people. So he will decide whether India is a wealthy nation, depending on whether all Indians' living standards are that of a wealthy nation. That of how people live matters in how well the state would feature in an index of affluence. So did this theory work? The demerit of absolute advantage theory, the drawbacks of the theory is there will be no ground of trade between both the countries unless there is an absolute advantage or absolute disadvantage in production of at least one commodity. So what Adam Smith otherwise says is, if you do not have an absolute advantage over Vestia, Tropica should not export wine. And if Vestia did not have an absolute disadvantage of producing garments, they should not import that. In other words, what it's saying is, don't get into things that you don't think you can make money. If it is more cheaper to do it in your country, do it. But if it is more cheaper to import it, do that. If it is cheaper to produce something in your country and export, then only you should get into that exporting. Otherwise, if there is no absolute advantage, don't do that. But because of this restrictive ability to trade, unless there was an absolute advantage, there were a lot of criticism leveled on this theory of absolute advantage. The most greatest criticism was leveled by this person, David Ricardo, who introduced the theory of comparative advantage. So the theory of comparative advantage is that it does not focus on absolute cost, but only on opportunity cost. Now you already know what the difference between an absolute and an opportunity cost is. The ability to make more in itself is not a measure of efficiency, Ricardo was saying. we must compare it against what is sacrificed for what is gained. The principle of comparative advantage is universal as it applies across individuals, firms, regions, and countries. So what Ricardo is saying is, now look, you don't have to have an absolute advantage because that would be too restrictive. What you need to be worried about is what you're going to sacrifice in order to gain something. So if you feel that producing a garment will take you 5 days and you're going to import it from Vestia, which takes only half a day, to import a garment from Vestia, what do you have to sacrifice? Is it a barrel of wine that you need to give? What is the cost of that wine? Do you have, so now in order to get loads from garments from Vestia, you need to produce more barrels of wine, some for your own consumption and some for export or as payment for the garments. So what is that opportunity cost? Earlier, if you needed to produce 10 barrels of wine for your own need, now you need to produce 20 barrels of wine so that you can send some barrels of wine in turn for garments. So that cost of producing that extra barrels of wine is called the opportunity cost. So what Ricardo is saying is measure the opportunity cost and then actually consider whether there's any worth in doing in that trade. So that is, if there is a worth, that is called the comparative advantage that you have over the other country in importing or exporting your goods. So the definition of comparative advantage earlier referred to the ability of a country to produce particular goods or services at lower opportunity cost as compared to the others in the field. So there are certain assumptions that you need to make in order to put this theory in motion. So the assumption has a lot of criticism. One assumption is that theory only considers labor cost. And the criticism is that it neglects all other non-labor related costs involved in the production. For example, the transport cost is not considered. Maybe the logistical cost is not considered. Then another assumption is all labor to be homogeneous. That is, this theory assumes that all the labor is not imported, but it's homegrown. Whereas the criticism to that is labor is heterogeneous due to different grades and kinds. So not that you can, for example, if you produce a certain kind of special vehicle in a country, you might need to get certain expertise that your country does not have. So that would require an importation of certain expert knowledge through people who have that knowledge. So it's importation of labor. So that cost is not considered. Then it also assumes a similar taste for all. The criticism for that, the downside is the taste differ with the growth of economies and income brackets. Then another assumption is a fixed proportion of labor is used in the production of all commodities, whereas the criticism to that is utilization of the proportion of labor depends on the type of commodity being produced. Then full employment. It assumes that the theory of comparative advantage assumes that if you go into production of something based on the opportunity cost, that you will get full employment. Then the criticism to that is every economy has an existence of underemployment. So it's not always full employment that is guaranteed. So because of this criticism, this comparative advantage theory is also attacked at certain instances. Here, I have included this video to better explain to you what the advantage and disadvantages of this thing is. You can watch it now.
Say that you had two friends who were interested in starting their own business. Yeah, you know, our whole town says pizza. What they have to do right now is, I can take an hour, only the diligence.
Okay, so you watched that. So that video gave you a good idea of the differences and the usefulness of the two theories that we discussed earlier, absolute and comparative advantage. So now we're going to move into two other famous theories that developed as a result of criticism on the Ricardian and Adam Smith theories. So we are going to look at two theories that were relatively recent, that was developed in the 20th century, really. The factor proportions hypothesis and the product cycle theory. First, we look at the factor proportions hypothesis. This was developed by Heckscher and Olin. So what is the factor proportions theory? It is a trade theory holding that countries produce and export those goods that require resources or factors that are abundant and thus cheapest, and import those goods that require resources that are in short supply. For example, Australia has a lot of land and a small population. So that is the factor relative to its size. So what should it export and import? So as you know, Australia is a country that exports a lot of agricultural products, milk, corn, and fruits, apples and oranges, and a lot of food exportation is like juices and meat, bran, so that kind of things which require a lot of land to grow. So the factor, the resource that they have in abundance would be land, and land is not inhabited because all land is not inhabited by the people, so they have a lot of free land because their small population is small. That land can be used for growing crops, rearing animals, for farms, so that they could use it for production of milk, for the production of animal meat, which would help them develop a sector or industry in food exports. So that is one example. Another example would be New Zealand on the same reasons. Well, China in that case is considered as a world's factory. So what is the factor that China has? A resource that they have in abundance would be labor, because their population, they are the world's biggest population. So they can get labor at the cheapest price. So they can manufacture a lot of things. So, most of the toys that we get in other countries is manufactured in China. Most of the electronic chips and electrical goods are manufactured in China. Almost all the things, there is hardly anything that China does not manufacture. So that is because they have land as well as, but more importantly, cheap labor to run all those factories. So if you take this theory and adopt the theory to China, the factors would be labor and land, that they could produce something which is cheapest and export it to a country which has it in short supply. For example, they can export their toys to Sri Lanka, where we do not have that kind of factories where we can manufacture our own toys. So it is cheaper for us to import from China than have the land or the resources or the labor to manufacture it here ourselves. So you understand this theory? It is a trade theory that holds that a country produces and exports those goods that require resources or factors that are abundant and thus cheap, and import those goods that require resources that are in short supply. Then this is basically putting in a little graph for more clarity. this is also the factor proportions hypothesis, or is also called the, because of the two economists who develop it, HO theorem. A capital abundant country will export the capital intensive good, while the labor abundant country will export the labor intensive good. The factor proportions model, which links export and imports to factor endowments, meaning that this theory explains that countries always import or export things based on the ground realities or the factors of their countries. Then for exports, a country exports those commodities produced with relatively large quantities of the country's relatively abundant factor. So this theory assumes that a country will only export things which they have more of, not which they lack.
Hello, I have a question.
Yes.
So now for this factor proportion theory,
Yes.
now an example is Sri Lanka uses Chinese labor for construction facilities, I mean services. So will that also be applicable for factor proportion theory? We are not using the Chinese labor within their country. We are getting the labor, I mean, we are getting them down to Sri Lanka and using for our construction facilities. So will that also be applicable?
No, well, I will not categorize it within this theory, but what you're talking about now, this is a factor proportions theory for the production. What you're talking about is a service. Now, you're talking about labor as a, now in international trade, we have trading of goods and trading of services. So labor we categorize under that cage of services and not so much of goods. But I applied this theory is for the historical development rather of this theory of international trade is purely based on the goods of importation of goods. But your question is pertinent in this way. Yes, we have a labor shortage of for construction purposes, and for whatever reason the government has felt that it is a service sector requirement that we should bring down our immigration rules to permit that kind of labor to come into the country and use that labor in the construction industry. There are so many things that are in play. Can I know your name, please?
Nikita.
Nikita, there are so many things at play here, Nikita, and it's not only trade in the importation of labor that plays here. Since you asked me this question, I'll just go into that briefly. There is something called investment that is involved here. Investment and trade, though people tend to mix it up, those are two different theories and laws that govern these things. What really happens in the Sri Lankan construction industry is because the investment itself is foreign funded or funded by China most of the time, for these projects where the Chinese labor do come into the country, that is most of the time it is considered a tied financial arrangement or what we call a tied aid. So when the initial program is negotiated between, let's say, the government of Sri Lanka or a governmental agency in Sri Lanka and the another government agency like the Treasury negotiates the loan is given on the condition that this number of workers will be imported from China for the project, and they will work in the project from the beginning to the end. And the payment for these laborers will also be arranged in a way that the money actually does not come into Sri Lanka, but are paid in China for the Chinese company who hires labor. So there are a lot of things that play in the importation of a service industry as opposed to the pure importation of goods. Do I answer your question?
Yes, I understood. Thanks a lot.
Okay. So can I move into the next point, or is there anything else you need to clarify?
No, you can move to the next point.
Okay. So
Thanks a lot.
Okay, you're welcome. So now we look into the product cycle theory, which is more or less the last theory that I have sought to explain here, because these four theories only are considered significant in the evolution of international trade theories. This is, in fact, a theory that has been developed in, I would say, relatively recently in the mid-1950s. And this theory, to put it briefly, is the product life cycle theory proposed by Raymond Vernon, who is a US economist who was based in the US and educated at Harvard, from what I remember, and who has only looked at the mechanism that is in operation in the US. And he bases that theory on the understanding of, in my opinion, the understanding of how trade works from a developed country's perspective. So what Vernon says is that he suggests that as products mature, both the location of sales and the optimal production location will change, affecting the flow and direction of trade. Now, before I move into the next limbs, an example for what he says in this point 1 is how the production of iPhone has changed location from its inception from US to China. Now, as many of you would know, currently the iPhone that we would be buying anywhere in the world, whether it's Sri Lanka or US, is an iPhone that is 90% made in China, in Chinese factories. Each particle is made in a different factory, assembled together, even though the US company, the Apple company in the US owns trademark and all the copyrights and intellectual property rights to the iPhone. The production is done in a different country than US itself. So that's what they say as the product mature. Now, initially when the iPhone was introduced, it was a new product. Production was quite efficient to maintain in the US itself because they had to first identify the market. But then the popularity of the iPhone grew so much all over the world that they have to produce 100,000 times much more than they initially planned for. So then they had to look at cheaper options to get the best possible advantage of trading for this good internationally. So certain factors matter, like the labor cost involved, the licensing costs involved, and they moved the factory to China purely for those labor cost reductions that they could achieve so that their profit can be higher. So in second point, I said that Vernon argued that the size and the wealth of the US market gave US firms a strong incentive to develop new products. So he looks at purely the US market itself. He says US is a very big country with a very big population that the companies can experiment in that country itself. So as the US market grew, the companies can put more into the research and development and develop new products for that market's consumption only. And then he says that initially the product would be produced and sold in the US. Later, as demand grew in other developed countries, US firms would begin to export. So iPhone is an example. Initially, it was for the US market itself, but then they found markets initially in other developed countries, for example, countries in the European region or East European region, Russia, and maybe few richer countries in the East Asian bloc like the Koreas and Japan. So first you experiment within the US, then you create a popularity or a following for your product, then you seek to outsource, then you seek to export and outsource at the same time. Then lastly, when over time demand for the new product would grow in other advanced countries, making it worthwhile for foreign producers to begin producing for their home markets. Now, for that, iPhone is not a good example because it is trademark protected, but for something else, like, for example, let's say a blender. And if a blender is first introduced just an example, I do not even know where the blender was invented. Let's assume that the blender was invented or a juicer was invented in the US. A variation of that blender or a juicer is tried out in research and development units of a factory in the US. And they put it to their market and they identify the market trend and they improve the technology of that. And they make that product so popular that the population spread, the popularity of the product spreads into Europe, and now they start exporting. And people in Europe who are used to exporting this blender now suddenly realize, oh, we have a market for this product in our countries as well. So why don't we try to produce that product in our countries as ourselves? So the last point is how foreign producers begin to produce for their home markets themselves. So it is a very I would say open and modern theory that Vernon had developed based on the ground realities today, more than what the example that we discussed earlier, the hypothetical case study. This is more relevant for how through globalization world has come to this kind of scenario where which I will be talking about later on in intellectual property rights and safeguarding those. I will give an example for that last point. Now, we all know that the first fast train that was invented, or the bullet train as we call it, was invented in Japan. And then Japanese companies realized that some of those engines and the technology that they had, the production cost could be less if they go to China, set up factory there, and start production there. So the Japanese claim that when they went and set up shop in China, their plants, that the Chinese who they got to work for them actually stole their trade secrets, their technological secrets, and China took that technology on board themselves, created their own companies, developed that technology, and now China owns the world's fastest train that goes faster than the Japanese bullet train. So we will go into those protection mechanisms and how the world has now sought to address these problems later on by way of many different treaties and agreements and laws. But this is the reality now. International trade has become so indispensable that every day countries have to balance against countries, or other companies have to balance against the interest of profit making and thereby getting their production cost low versus the interest of safeguarding their intellectual property rights and trade secrets. So this production life cycle theory is, I suppose, even though it's relatively new, is a very important evolution of the theory of international trade as to why trade is needed and how we navigate through all those barriers that modern trade throws our way. So, I'm sorry, it's not very clear, this one. The product life cycle theory was developed during the 1960s. And focused in the US, since most innovations came from the US market. At one point, when soon after the Second World War, everything that was, when the rest of the world was trying to come back to its original state at the end of around 1944, US still remained quite unaffected. Japan was devastated from the war. France, Germany was initially, before the World War, was the most industrialized country in the world at that time. Germany, France, England, that had a huge cost to pay from the world. All of them were trying to get back on their feet. US, that still remained unaffected, they had enough affluent population that could get into creative thinking and innovation at a very faster pace than the rest of the world. So a lot of new things came to the market from the United States at that point. So this was an applicable theory, like I said earlier, at the time since US dominated the world trade. China was not heard of at that time. China was a recent, as we know about, China developed and opened up in the last 30 years or so. So today, the US is no longer the only innovator of products in the world. We know that today China produces so many of the world's innovative, platforms to internet products to technological products than at a faster pace than any other country in the world. And China was not even in the picture in the 1960s. And today, companies design new products and modify them much quicker than before. Companies are forced to introduce products in many different markets at the same time to gain cost benefits before its sales declines. So the competition in today's world than when Vernon was presenting this theory in 1960s is very different. It's not only because US is no longer the lab of the world to come out with new inventions. It is also because the competition is so high and the demand is also so high that it is not any longer about the new innovative product or an upgrade of an existing product, but how soon you can get into the market. So a lot of factors depend on that outcome. The labor, the technical know-how, the ground realities, as in the infrastructure of getting something at the lowest time from the factory to the port, to the ship, from the container to the actual market. So all of those things factor into something like that. That is why, one of the most important things in a country's development towards an export-oriented economy is how fast it can develop its infrastructure, like roads, highways, and here we call it expressways. If your production site is somewhere, for example, in Sri Lanka, if your production site is somewhere in Anuradhapura, once a finished garment is made in Anuradhapura, how fast can you bring it from Anuradhapura to the Colombo port, which is the only port we have for exporting it out of Sri Lanka to maybe Belarus or somewhere to sell the finished product. So all of those things factor in a country or in a company's competitive advantage over another different country. We know that some time ago, when in the 80s and 90s, Sri Lanka had a vibrant market garment industry, but that faced stiff competition from Bangladesh, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And that is because more than anything else, the labor was cheap in Bangladesh. If the cost of labor for a item of garment was 100 rupees in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh they could do it for 20 rupees. So increasingly the companies, the foreign investors that used to come to Sri Lanka to set up these garment factories went towards other Cambodia and Bangladesh as countries that offered cheaper labor, because ultimately the cost of production, the benefit or the profit that you get out of the cost of production being low can help outweigh some of the downsides, maybe. Even if the Bangladesh infrastructure system was not so great and you had more cost involved in the transportation, that cost could have been outweighed by the low prices of labor. So things like that. So what I put in this slide is that the product life cycle theory is not the same, is not applicable to the world as it is. The world has progressed so much from the 1960s to today. And the theory does not explain the trade patterns of today. That is what I think. You might have a different idea about it if you look at it in depth. I briefly sought to touch up on this last theory that I have mentioned here. The diamond advantage theory, it's relatively new, as you can see, in 1990s. So what is diamond model. The diamond model is an economical model developed by Michael Porter in his book, The Comparative Advantage of Nations. Like Adam Smith presented his theory in The Wealth of Nations. Here is Michael Porter also introducing a theory that has called the attention of the economists in the world, who considered it vital enough to discuss it in the evolution of international trade theories. Firm strategies, he breaks it down in certain, his theory can be broken down under certain headings. One is that a strategy, structure, and drivers, the way in which companies are created, set goals, and are managed, the presence of intense rivalry in the home base. So what he says is, if you experience a stiff competition in your own home base, you might end up setting goals which might bring you the highest revenue. And I told you that this is a relatively new 1990s theory. So what this theory, quite different to the theory of Adam Smith or Ricardo in the 17th century, is that this theory is more oriented towards companies. And we are not looking at trade as country to country. We are looking at now in the 1990s, we are looking at trade as company or individual versus another individual or a company. Then he says the factor conditions are human resources. I just talked to you about the garment industry and the labor costs, so the human resources. Physical resources, I talked to you about the infrastructure. Then knowledge resources. I'll take an example for that in a bit. Then capital resources and infrastructure. So knowledge resources is now Sri Lanka is increasingly developing a reputation for BPO industries or business process outsourcing. So for that, you need to have a knowledge resource base. That means for that kind of industry, we need people who are conversant with computer technology or the ability to use a computer even for data, for document screening. Most of the business process outsourcing companies do. For example, let's say somebody in New York goes to the Bank of New York and wants to apply for a loan. So the bank gives a certain set of documents and say, fill this and hand over, and then we will consider your loan application. So when the bank receives these documents, there are certain things that they need, there is a checklist, certain things that you need to check whether as to whether you have gotten that information from these documents of this person. Now, if the bank, like in the old days, try to do this manually through the officers, that will require a very higher number of labor on the bank's part. If the bank usually operates with 5 employees at that branch, probably you might need another 2 or 3 employees just to screen documents that they receive on a daily basis. And let's assume the pay for one employee for the day is $100. So that would mean if for a month it might be $30,000 or $3,000, sorry. So what the companies in the US do is they went around and checked certain countries, not all countries, certain countries with a certain amount of high literacy and technological knowledge, and they, I think, first initially in the maybe Indian subcontinent, like India, or I think in India, they started out this these kind of business process outsourcing companies where they can recruit 50 people for very low wages who had the knowledge and the capacity to check a document online, follow a checklist, and screen that document and say whether this document has all of this information that we require, and approve that document and send feedback back to the bank. And for the price that the bank would have paid for one employee to do that in the US, they can get 10 people down in India to do the same job. So they started outsourcing little jobs like that and created a whole very lucrative industry called the business or BPO industry, business process outsourcing. Now, I was telling you earlier, Sri Lanka itself has so many of these. WNS has been one, and I don't know all the names, but we have so many of these companies in Sri Lanka, where basically all we do here is, for a significant pay in Sri Lankan terms, somebody sits in front of a computer during a certain period of time that the US or the UK is working. They screen documents according to a checklist given by the companies in that country, checks whether everything is in order. If not, they mention that in comments and send it back. So these are factors that you would consider, or factor conditions, as Porter talks about in this diamond model theory, in deciding where and how the international trade would flow. Then the demand conditions. In the home market can help companies create a competitive advantage. So what he's saying is, for example, let's take the home market of the United States and the car industry in the US. The GMC, or the General Motor Companies, is one of the oldest, or maybe the oldest motor manufacturing company in US. And Ford is another company that have plants in Detroit for car manufacturing. So in the diamond model, what he's saying is, a country need not always compete internationally. They can first compete locally and establish a comparative advantage in their home base before they go out internationally to test their products. Then related and supporting industries can produce inputs which are important for innovation and internationalization. So research and development, or R&D, that we talk about in a company. I told you Porter is purely looking at international trade from the perspective of a private company and not from the perspective of a state, as we are used to looking at it from Adam Smith and Ricardo's theories. So he's saying you need to have supporting industries in your country itself that gives you certain input which are favorable for you, that will help you as a develop as a more attractive proposition for international trade. For example, what he's saying is let's take the Apple phone. Initially, now you have something called the Apple Watches. So if you had another company in the US itself, or that could create that Apple Watch that you can sell as a banded item to the Apple phone, that would be a supporting industry to market your product internationally. Whereas in another country, let's say in China, Huawei only produces phones. Here is a company in the United States that produces a phone that is more attractive, and not only that, you will get another item called the Apple Watch that goes with the phone, and you have the Apple company has a subsidiary or a supporting industry that would do that for Apple, so that they could look more attractive when they go and compete internationally. So it's a different shift from the other theories, but I suppose more pertinent and applicable for the trade sector today than the times of Adam Smith or Ricardo, for that thing. Then we already got a little introduction to free trade in our hypothetical case study. And free trade is the buzzword now. Whether it works or doesn't work is always an argument. You will see when World Trade Organization sits at its summits, there are various protests happening, whether it's Geneva or New York or London. There is the Occupy Wall Street movement, like that. There is the 1% and 99% movement in the US, where as much as there are proponents for free trade, there are opponents as well. and I'm sure you all know about it and you grew up learning about it. So what is this free trade? So one of the biggest shifts in the world from a protectionism, infant industry protection mindset to bringing down all barriers for trade and opening up your borders, so to say, to deal with international ideas of trade, was to say, okay, I do not have any restrictions, I do not give quotas, I do not impose tariffs, I do not restrict the sectors that you can deal with in my country. You're all welcome to come here and trade or try to sell your goods. So there are advantages and disadvantages of trade, free trade, which we will look into more in depth next time. But here is a small video that I want to first show to you before I get into the theory of it. Let's watch it for now.
Free trade.
Oh, I'm sorry, wait, let me try to finish that one. Okay, so that was a brief introduction to free trade. So if you look at the evolution of free trade or the concept of free trade, so we discussed in a hypothetical case study as well earlier. In around the mid 19th century, most of the advanced European countries has established free trade within their borders. When we say established free trade, we only mean where the developed countries were dealing with each other, not so much of England bringing down its trade barriers and opening up its market for Sri Lanka. The United Kingdom at the time would have put down their board all kinds of restrictions for maybe motor trade between United Kingdom and Germany, was also a developed country around that period of time, and also one of his neighbors that it was easier for them to deal with. First major breakaway from the protectionism came from Britain with the repeal of the Corn Law of 1846. That is a very important landmark in the history of world trade, where initially England, or the Britain at the time, had a law that imposed serious restrictions, or sometimes did not did not permit any kind of importation of corn into the country. So even though British or the Britain was an empire that sold a lot of its products and manufactured goods to every single of its colony and to other non-colonial developed countries in the world, they had a lot of protectionism mechanisms within themselves, within that country itself, that they did not permit certain goods coming into their countries that would affect, for example, in this instance, agricultural industry in their own country. But in 1846, the king at the time, I forget it was the king at the time, decided that it was time to bring down the corn law, take out the corn law and the restrictions, and open that sector up for trading. As we will examine maybe on the next day, one of the main reasons for doing that is you feel that when you bring in something that you're already manufacturing, it will help your own industry to become more competitive and raise its quality of production, and bring it to a place where it is free to compete with other similar products that are brought into the country, and in turn enhance the quality and the production capacity within your country itself. At least that is the theory of free trade. That is the beneficial part of free trade. It doesn't always happen, as we can see through various examples of the developing countries that have been fast to introduce free trade, like sometimes Sri Lanka has been very fast to introduce new theories. So this was followed by unilateral removal, reduction of hundreds of tariffs in most imported goods. And we are still talking about Britain. First, they took down the corn law. Then step by step, they reduced or took away a lot of other barriers that they had imposed within the country to ensure that there is enough protection for their own industry. So they started taking down most of those barriers. And Britain entered into a number of free trade agreements with other countries, beginning with the Cobden-Cavalier Treaty of 1860 with France. So free trade agreements, which were negotiated bilaterally, had a very long history to the king's time even. So Britain was one of the pioneers of these free trade agreements, where for a very specific country, and in this instance, France, they would bring down all kinds of barriers for France, for the importation, in France's case, for the exporting of their finished products into Britain. There were no tariffs, no quotas, no industries in which importation was not permitted, none of those things. They completely opened up. This was a test case, I think, for the developed world as well, where there were minimal or absolutely no barriers for trading. You were almost equal to a domestic enterprise. Then, with the advent of the First World War, it massively disrupted the international trading relationships. When the First World War came around, that familiarity or the friendships that nations have and their freedom or their willingness to trade with each other, it all vanished away. The environment completely changed. The mistrust that entered into the countries and the population alike was something that prevented them from depending on international relationships to foster their trade. And in 1920s, with the Great Depression setting, many domestic economies and the world economy at largely collapsed. With the Depression, a lot of factories in industrial nations like Germany, UK, they all had to close down. And basically, like we experienced this during COVID, basically production and trading halted. And the governments had to step in to bail out those companies from their loans to basically provide people for their survival. This led to the countries adopting extreme measures of protectionism in an attempt to preserve domestic production and employment. So the Great Depression was a sort of changed things around 360, and whereas countries were now had gotten used to opening up their borders, suddenly felt concerned that now our people are out of their jobs, they're out of their money, so they're not able to. If we continue to allow foreign goods to come into our country, our people will not be able to match those prices. So our goods that are produced now on factories will not sell. That would not encourage more employment opportunities. And now unemployment was a serious issue. So the countries had to go back to those protectionism mentality to give an economy a boost so that they could stand up again on their own two feet. So the most notorious of them being the 60% import tax imposed by US, which was quickly retaliated by the major trading partners of US. One of the first to do this was United States, which imposed a 60% tax on anything and everything that was imported into the United States after the Great Depression. So that was another way of saying to the exporters, don't send your goods here. If you want to put your goods in our market, you have to pay a 60% tax as against the value of their goods. So that is as good as not sending any products to US. So in 1934, USA started trade liberalization again, but this time bilaterally. They did not open their borders up to everybody at the same time. First they opened their bilateral trade liberalization with Canada, and likewise they did in like a bilateral agreement as opposed to opening it up for everybody. And in 1944, the Second World War was almost coming to an end, and then we have the Bretton Woods. You would perhaps know that Bretton Woods is an important stepping stone in the world's history in a lot of things which are multilateral. By 1944, when it was reasonably clear that the allies, that the World War II would shortly be won, led by Britain and the US, they put their minds, actually Churchill is one of the most influential figures that directed the world towards Bretton Woods. They put their minds to developing strategies for the reconstruction of world economy, because at the end of, by around 1944, the world realized the destruction that was caused by the Second World War was not something that they ever want to imagine again. So the leaders, especially people like Churchill, at the time felt obligated to create something that would help not just Britain or not just US, but the whole world, especially the European nations who are now devastated, like Germany because of it, and France, to help these economies and Japan rebuild and reconstruct. So they put their minds to work when most of these countries met in a place called Bretton Woods of Massachusetts in United States, close to Boston, but in the same state. So as a result, the Bretton Woods Agreement was drafted to create three key institutions. So the world leaders got together, they deliberated for over 2 weeks, I believe. And everybody agreed that we need an international institution who will finance the reconstruction and development of the world. And they created this institution called the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which we famously call the World Bank. That's the proper name, IBRD. And they also had a plan to create an institution that will take care of trade, now disrupted after 2 world wars. So some of the leaders proposed an institution called the International Trade Organization, or ITO. But following the end of the world, what actually got established or created was the IMF and the World Bank. However, the International Trade Organization, or the ITO, did not come into existence. And that was mainly due to the objections of the United States politicians themselves, or the Congress, because they felt that it would be a threat to their sovereignty or the sovereign immunity. So you will see that even though it is a concept that was brought about by the developed nations themselves, the moment they see something is not going to be beneficial for them, they themselves put a spoke. The United States is very famous for this, as you can see even now. Trump pulling out of most of the trade agreements that is there in the world, that he pulled out of the TPP or transatlantic trade agreement. He pulled out of NAFTA. So the moment that you see your sovereignty or your advantage is lost, if you join in something, US is always famous for pulling out of that. So US was all right to create IMF. US was all right to create World Bank because both of those two institutions guaranteed a veto power to the United States. It is drafted in the IMF constitution that the World Bank constitution, that the president of the World Bank will always be a United States citizen. And in the selection of the IMF chairperson, the United States has a special voting right. So those two institutions, whether you like it or not, are very dependent on the United States. However, United States did not see that they could maintain that same sort of power over the trade body of things, so to say. So there was a lot of opposition within the country itself. So that led to that institution actually not being created. Till we come to the, well, actually, I think this would be a good place to take a very short break of about 10 minutes, 10 to, yeah. Let's take a break for 10 minutes before we start on the World Trade Organization and the developments from there on. So I will see you all at 4:45 after a 10-minute break. Now we will look at the World Trade Organization as we know it. So first, this black and white picture is a picture of the from Bretton Woods actually, and you can see the designations of the people who had attended the meeting in Bretton Woods. It was mainly a white people's affair at the time. For the birth of GATT, I'm sure you all have heard about GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. I told you a little while earlier that ITO, or the International Trade Organization, that was contemplated in Bretton Woods, never happened, but that led to the creation of GATT. GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, is actually a spin-off of the agreement that was to create the international ITO. In place of ITO, a provisional agreement was negotiated between 23 major trading countries in the world as a prelude to the ITO and as an adoption of the Havana Charter. Now, Havana Charter was, Havana was the place that the world leaders at the time from these 23 countries got together and drafted the agreement that would create the International Trade Organization, and this was in 1948. But the reason why ITO, or the International Trade Organization, could not be created subsequent to Havana, as I told you, was that, you know, in international law, there's something called dualistic and a monolistic system. Now, Sri Lanka is a dualistic system. That means if an international treaty, if we want to subscribe to that international treaty, that would only become law in Sri Lanka if that is passed, if a corresponding law is passed in Sri Lanka, bringing that international treaty into law in Sri Lanka. Otherwise, it will not amount to law as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, and we will not be bound by it. The same system applies in USA. Because we are all considered common law countries. There are two main legal systems in the world. In civil law countries, or most of the civil law countries, they are monolithic countries. That means the moment that you sign an international treaty, it becomes law in your country. You do not need to pass an individual legislation in your country to put that in motion. So in the United States, after the countries, including the United States representatives and the UK representatives, drafted this Havana at the in Havana, drafted this charter, the United States Senate or their parliament refused to accept that charter. As I told you earlier, they considered it it would lead to surrendering their sovereign immunity, meaning they will be liable to be sued in any country for anything that they do. So they felt at the time that it was not necessary. So Havana Charter never came into being, and there was no ITO. However, somewhere in 1940, around 1947, Havana Charter was refused by the United States Senate in 1940, but somewhere in 1947, when these 23 countries got together, they reached a certain agreement on tariffs and trade that would affect all countries, all of those 23 countries. Basically, this is an agreement that said, okay, if you want to trade with one of us, you cannot or can have this kind of tariffs. And if you are going to have a tariff for importation, and for instance, if United States want to trade with United Kingdom, United States would have to be on the same level on certain things as United Kingdom. Now, you can't impose a 60% charge on imported goods as a tariff, but expect to go and sell your products in United Kingdom without any tax being paid. So if the tax that you have to pay in the United Kingdom is only 20%, then there should be a reciprocal duty in the United States also to bring the export tax lower to 20% and not stay at 6%. So that's just an example, but there are many other tariffs and trade-related embargoes that the countries discussed and what was acceptable and what was not. And they put this down in an agreement that is referred to as the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, or what we call it as GATS. So what GATS did was, in the vacuum of the ITO, which never came into being or which was really stillborn, GATS provided a platform for initially for these 23 countries and later on for the countries who joined in, sort of a mechanism, or really sort of a platform to get together and discuss and agree on modes and mechanisms that are beneficial for each other and not just for one person to proceed with international trade. So GATT in fact became the permanent institutional base for multilateral world trading regime until the fairly recent creation of the World Trade Organization. So it was GATT until the creation of the World Trade Organization, which happened only after 1994, I think. Until that time, from 1944, it was GATT that was in place. So in place of ITO, a provisional agreement was negotiated between 23 major trading countries in the world as a prelude to ITO and as an adoption of the Havana Charter that led to the creation of General Agreements on Tariffs Trade, commonly referred to as GATT. GATT, in fact, became the permanent. I think there's a repetition of, there's a repetition of the 2 points there. But what I wanted to tell you was that GATT had actually 8 rounds throughout, from the period of 1947 till 1994. And it is at the 8th round of GATT that the World Trade Organization was contemplated. But you know, the 8th round, or what we call the Uruguay round, it started in 1987 and it actually concluded in 1994. It took 7 years. And at the end of the Uruguay round, the what we call the Marrakesh Agreement, or the agreement to create the World Trade Organization, was born, and the countries that were present there at the time, they all became signatories to this creation of this institution, including the United States. So there's a small point form of what the World Trade Organization is. It is, this is a picture of the World Trade Organization in Brussels. It's the headquarters is based in Brussels. It's an international organization embodied in the result of, as a result of the Uruguay round, established on the 1st of January 1995. Membership is 164 countries. The secretariat around 600 staff, headed by a director general based in Geneva. So what is WTO? WTO is a contract. The cornerstone of the multilateral trading system. That's how we refer to it. It's actually a great achievement, I think, in the world order, to be able to agree on an institution that could regulate world internationally is a huge deal. It is not so simple as having an institution like the IMF that could sort of guide the world central banks, or the World Bank that could sort of guide and assist in the world reconstruction and development. But this is trade is more primal in that sense, because people are driven by profit and personal gain, and to be able to set a institution that will govern how you trade or how you do that, how you make your money, when not even two companies in the same country can agree on those things. I think it's a huge deal to have an international organization that will try to tell people from different countries and different localities on how they should trade. So that is the purpose of World Trade Organization, to regulate international trade. Now, whether it actually achieves that purpose fully is a different matter, which is why there is so much of criticism against World Trade Organization, as we will look into on the next day. So the idea of creating this institution was really that, to create a level playing field for everybody in international trade. So the trading goods, earlier, one of you asked me the question about trading, which I had to answer through trading services. The trading goods is called GATT. The trading services is GATS. General Agreement on Trade and Services is GATS. General Agreement on Trade and Tariff is GATT. Protection of intellectual property rights. The agreement that is there is TRIPS. That is trade-related intellectual property rights. Then trade-related investment measures, what we call as TRIMS. We will look into all of these individually, maybe if not today, on the next day. Then rights and obligations of parties. And very importantly, one of the biggest achievements of the World Trade Organization, I would say, is to create a permanent ad hoc dispute resolution mechanism. Because until that time, the world really lacked a dedicated institution where countries or companies can sue each other when there has been a breach of the customs, practices, agreements, treaties by one party as opposed to another. Now, WTO created what is called the WTO ad hoc dispute settlement mechanism. And Sri Lanka, in fact, has been, we have been sued in that. There's a very complicated multi-tiered dispute resolution mechanism which the WTO adopts. And we had a case against one of our companies that deal in rubber. The case was filed by the United States Department of Trade against this company, and we at the Attorney General's Department was also involved in it because it involved a company in Sri Lanka, and we won this case. Initially we lost, then we went in appeal. It involved a subsidy that the United States said was contrary to the protection given in the WTO agreement, where all parties have been considered to be on a level playing field. which prohibits subsidies and other kinds of benefits that companies are given by the state. And the United States claim was that this particular company has obtained or had been the beneficiary of certain rubber subsidies given by the Sri Lankan government, and therefore their production cost is low, and therefore their competition is not fully transparent and on the same level playing field as others. But on our defense, we have argued that it is in fact subsidies are not excluded for certain countries from the requirements. You see, WTO has two different, what we will look at in a little bit, two different sets of rules for developing countries and developed countries. For developing countries, the WTO rules are very good. They say you can take a certain number of agreed periods or blocks of time to come to a certain level of development before you fully open up your or fully bring down the tariffs and other trade mechanisms. And in one of those, they say subsidies for certain industries are permitted. So on those arguments, we actually won that case, I think in 2018 or so. So the objectives of WTO, one is to raise standards of living of everybody in everywhere in the world. It is not limited to the developing countries or least developing or middle income countries. It's for everybody to ensure full employment, growing volume of real income and effective demand, expanding the production of trade in goods and services, sustainable development. Now, environmental protection has become a huge issue in development. So WTO stands for sustainable development. I'm sure you have heard about it, how development has to go in hand with the protection of environment. Then developing countries. One of WTO's main focuses is to create a level playing field in the international trade scenario for developing countries. And how hard that is to achieve, you would see, we talked about protest earlier, it is extremely difficult to do. So WTO's main functions: implementation, administration, and operation of the covered agreements, forum for negotiations. Every year WTO will have their annual meeting, so that's a forum for negotiation. Then dispute settlement, review of national trade policies. So each country's trade policies or developments will be reviewed by WTO, and if you are a signatory, and if your trade policies involve something which is more restrictive than you're permitted to do, WTO will tell you to take down that piece of legislation that would hinder the trade for the countries. Then coherence in global economic policy making. So the WTO structure, ministerial conferences, so at the ministers level, each country's minister responsible for trade will attend these ministerial conferences. Then the General Council dispute settlement body. General Council consists of two things: dispute settlement body and trade policy review body. And councils for trade in goods, a separate council for trade in services, and council for TRIPS, that is trade investment related things. Then committees and other subsidiary bodies, and decision making is always achieved through consensus. There has to be the required number of votes that are in favor of a certain decision before it is adopted. And I will talk to you about it later as to why we could not have gotten a multilateral agreement on investment. That is because the WTO could not get the necessary consensus to create an international treaty on investment like they have done for trade. So the WTO basic principles: trade without discrimination. That is what we call the most favored nation clause, or the MFN clause. We'll go into, I'm only doing an introduction of those things today, but maybe we could look at it in depth on the next day. Then the national treatment means if you are say we have a foreign investor or a foreign trading company in Sri Lanka that sells rice, the government cannot have a separate set of benefits for the rice producers in Sri Lanka, who are Sri Lankans and locals, that would give them a market advantage over the rice exporters that come and tap our market. Let's say a rice exporter of Vietnam who would try to come to Sri Lanka and sell his rice. He cannot be disadvantaged in his trade here due to the subsidies or advantages that the rice manufacturers in Sri Lanka get. That would be violative of the national treatment policies. Now, most favored nation, I didn't give you an example. It is a theory that, for example, United States cannot get a treatment more favorable for US companies than I would give for United Kingdom. So if United Kingdom, if we say, okay, in Sri Lanka, the companies from United Kingdom can come and invest in the telecommunications sector, but you can bring 100 employees only to Sri Lanka for your purposes. But we tell the United States, you can also come and set up your telecommunications in Sri Lanka, but in your case, I feel only 50 people from your experts can come and work in Sri Lanka. So then United States will say, you have favored United Kingdom over me, whereas we are both foreign investors of foreign countries. If you're giving a benefit to United Kingdom and allowing them to bring 100 employees here, I should be given the same benefit. Otherwise, it would be, you have favored another nation over me. So those things, those kind of discriminations are prevented in the WTO agreements. Then transparency. WTO insists that your tradings with one country should be transparent so that another country would know how exactly Sri Lanka would be trading with China. You cannot have under-the-counter deals. Everything must be transparent. Then predictable and growing access to markets. So government policies and trade practices have to be predictable. They cannot and should not change with changing regimes, so to say. A foreign trading partner ought to be able to predict, okay, I got this kind of benefit this year. Because of that, I'm setting up shop here, and I hope to get the same benefit for the next 10 years. So that if a government changes and a new government comes and suddenly says, no, I'm going to put a stop to this, that will be considered a very unpredictable nature, unpredictable trade policy, which is prohibited. Then trading goods, binding of tariffs, prohibition of quantitative restrictions, tariff negotiations, progressive reduction and protection, emergency import remedies, safeguards are there, tariff renegotiations, compensation. Those when you're trying to renegotiate tariffs, if you later on bring down something, that benefit should be given to those foreign companies by way of compensation. And then it deals with trading services as well. Then dispute resolution, I told you earlier, which is very important. This has an integrated dispute settlement system. It covers trading goods, services, and intellectual property. Strict timelines are there for dispute mechanism, meaning like this a dispute settlement has to be reached within, say, 2 months or 6 months or something like that. Then adoption of a panel of reports, meaning the reverse of consensus. Then an appellate body of review, which is very important. You get a decision. If you're not happy, you have another body there to appeal against the decision. Then if there is non-compliance with the decision, the WTO can recommend certain measures against that country or that company who refuses to implement its decision. Then special and differential treatment, which is permitted under the WTO. I told you earlier, certain measures and special measures are adopted with respect to developing countries. So these things are permitted for reasons well understood under the treaty. So growing membership of one reason for doing that is they want to increase the number of memberships. They want to increase the membership with developing countries being part of it. So these are the articles. You can download the GET and check these articles. Enabling clause, those are very important if you want in detail. Then legal assistance. Actually, Sri Lanka is getting a lot of legal assistance from WTO. In drafting our trade agreements, there was a WTO-sponsored expert who was always present at the Department of Trade in Sri Lanka in helping us develop our trade policies. And we were, I think until last year, we were negotiating a free trade agreement with China and India. So these experts used to help us with our policies and bringing down tariffs and the time periods and special and differential treatments and things like that. Then provisions aimed at increasing trade opportunities. That is the idea of special and differential treatments. Provisions which require WTO members to safeguard the interest of developing country members. Then provisions allowing flexibility to developing countries in the use of economic and commercial policy instruments. The same here, that is important because that same flexibility is not available for developed countries. Then provisions allowing longer transitional periods to developing countries. I told you earlier in our early example of Tropica got Vestia asked them, how long do you think you will need to bring your dish industry to this stage where you can compete with us? So they said 10 years. Like that is an example of this. WTO will give you provisional time periods, allowing you to transition from your infant industry to bring your infant industry to a level where it can compete internationally. And then you will have to bring down the tariffs and other kinds of trade barriers that you have imposed in respect of that trade in your country. Then for least developed countries, there's even more favorable terms under the WTO. Ministerial declarations in favor of least developed countries, then differential and more favorable treatment for these least developed countries. Decisions on measures concerning the possible negative effects of the reform program on least developed and net food importing developing countries. You can actually look at those things. They are available on the internet. Then plan of action for the least developed countries. High-level meetings, integrated frameworks, and market access. They advise on market access, and actually WTO negotiates with more developed countries for market access on behalf of the least developed countries. Sri Lanka doesn't fall into the least developed countries. In Asia, I think Laos falls into a least developed countries. Bhutan falls into a least developed country. Places like that. Then provisions aimed at increasing trade opportunities require WTO members to safeguard the we went through that. Then the Doha Development Agenda, or what we call the DDA. This was launched in 2001 and followed by the Cancun ministerial meeting in September 2003. Now, Doha and Cancun meetings are important because Cancun failed to bring about any sort of agreement that the world expected the WTO countries to reach. It failed to rescue the 3 of the 4 rulemaking issues known as the Singapore issues on investment, competition, and government procurement. Only trade facilitation survived. So I told you earlier, the world attempted to reach consensus on investment. But you would be surprised to hear that the countries that opposed a multilateral treaty on investment is not the developed countries, but it was the developing countries. Countries who felt that if this kind of investment agreement was brought about, that would be disadvantageous for them because the more developed countries will know how to get that advantage and come and set up shop in their countries without any kind of barriers, any kind of national content or requirements for development of the host country or any kind of barriers that would somehow give some sort of hope for the developing country to benefit out of it. So the developing country is vehemently opposed to investment agreements, government procurements and competition. Then market access negotiations also suspended in 2008. There were international negotiations about uniformity in market access. That was also, I believe, mostly opposed by the developing countries. Then regional trade arrangements or RTAs. So SAARC area had a regional SAARC trading agreement to which we were part of. So you can see in 1970s there was only 6, 1991 31, in 2003 it increased to 189, and by 2012 there are 221 regional trade agreements in the world. And one of the famous, and I think the first, I could be wrong, but as far as I remember, NAFTA on North American Free Trade Agreement, which is between the United States and Canada initially, and later United States, Canada, and Mexico, that was in place till Trump pulled out of it, was one of the first regional trade agreements. And the European Union is one of the, I would say, success stories of regional trade agreement in the world. These are just few important definitions I thought I'll give for you all. It's just an introduction and you can read it for yourselves on these things. Then in conclusion of the World Trade Organization part, I would say from the 20th century type FTAs to 21st century type FTAs. Now we are moving from what we call the first generation free trade agreements to modern free trade agreements. Now, if you look at the Sri Lanka-Singapore free trade agreements, that is one of the most favorable free trade agreements, I would say, that is in place with Sri Lanka. It is considered the 21st century type FTA. Of course, that is being challenged in Supreme Court at the moment by the GMOA and so many other people. But it is signed and it is in place since about 2 years ago or 1 year ago, I think. Then from on the board issues to behind the board issues. So those are the terms that the WTO would like to promote. Then bilateral FTAs to interregional FTAs with wider spectrum. So WTO is encouraging countries not just to reach agreement between two countries, but make it a region which will benefit many states than just two states. And multilateralizing regionalism beyond regionalization of international trade. Those are concepts that the WTO stands for. I was planning to do the WTO TRIMs, or the trade investment measures, trade-related investment measures. I do not think I could maybe quickly do this. Okay, article, you can actually download the TRIMs agreement and look at it. So these are just brief, only important clauses for you to know. This is an agreement that applies to investment measures related to trading goods only, not services. So national treatment and quantitative restrictions. No member shall apply any TRIM that is inconsistent with the provisions of Article 3. An illustrative list of TRIMs is contained in the annex of this agreement. Then Article 4, developing country members, temporary deviations, like I told you, certain benefits that the developing countries get. Notification and transitional arrangements, transparency committee on TRIMs, consultation and dispute settlement review by Council of Trading Goods. You can read this for yourself, actually. It's interesting if you download the TRIMs and see what kind of measures that if you try to agree on an international investment related agreement, what kind of measures you need to put in place in your own country to abide by these regulations. And that's it from me. I hope it was useful. And I hope you would have benefited from this exercise. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you so much.